It was a warm afternoon in early June, the kind of day that carried a mix of excitement and nostalgia. The small-town high school gym was buzzing with voices, camera flashes, and the smell of flowers. Rows of folding chairs filled the floor, and proud families packed the bleachers waving at their sons and daughters in blue gowns. Near the middle row, a man named James Miller slowly made his way to his seat. He wore a neatly pressed shirt, his shoes shining even though they had seen better days. In one hand he carried a cane, and in the other a small American flag pin that used to sit on his old uniform. His back was straight, though the years had not been kind to him. The limp was permanent, a quiet reminder of a past most people only read about. James was a retired Army veteran. He had served 22 years before an injury ended his career. He didn't talk much about his service, not out of bitterness, but because he didn't like attention. To him, service was something you did, not something you bragged about. Today wasn't about him anyway. It was about his son, Ethan. The boy he'd raised mostly on his own after his wife passed away when Ethan was 8. Today, that boy was graduating high school, the first in their family to do so, and soon heading off to college. As James settled into his seat, he looked around the gym. The walls were covered with banners. Class of 2025. In bold letters, blue and white balloons tied to every corner. A local brass band was tuning their instruments near the stage. Parents whispered excitedly, waving at their kids sitting in neat rows of caps and gowns. James smiled to himself. For once, he felt completely at peace. He'd spent years worrying whether he was doing enough, whether Ethan was getting everything he needed. But seeing his son up there sitting tall, smiling with his friends, that was enough to quiet every doubt. Near the front, a few police officers stood along the sides of the gym, helping keep order as more guests arrived. One of them, Officer Bradley, was hard to miss. He was tall, broad-shouldered, and wore his sunglasses indoors, leaning against the wall like he owned the place. He had a reputation around town for being loud, confident, and sometimes just a bit too full of himself. James noticed him but didn't think much of it. He'd seen that type before, people who mistook authority for respect. Still, today wasn't a day to hold grudges. As the principal stepped up to the microphone, the noise in the gym began to fade. The band played the opening tune, and soon the national anthem began. Instinctively, James rose to his feet. He balanced his weight on his cane and stood tall, bringing his hand to his forehead in a salute. It was second nature to him. He had done it thousands of times, in the desert, in the rain, under flags that flew high and proud. This time it was for his son, but from a few feet away, a low chuckle broke through the respectful silence. "Guess some folks can't let go of the uniform," a voice muttered. James turned slightly, and his eyes landed on Officer Bradley. The man had his arms crossed, smirking as if he'd just cracked a private joke. Two parents near him looked away, uncomfortable, pretending they hadn't heard. James didn't say anything. He just lowered his hand and focused on the flag again, finishing the anthem in silence. When the song ended, everyone clapped. James eased back into his seat, his leg aching a little. A moment later, Bradley walked past his row, checking something on his phone. As he passed, he said under his breath, "Still playing soldier, huh?" James looked up calmly. "Old habits die hard," he said quietly. Bradley shrugged. "Yeah, must be nice getting thanked for sitting around these days." James didn't respond. He'd learned long ago that some words weren't worth answering. Instead, he focused his gaze on the stage where the principal was now welcoming everyone. From across the gym, Ethan spotted his father. He noticed the brief exchange, the way his dad's jaw tightened just a bit and the officer's smug grin as he walked away. Ethan didn't know exactly what had been said, but he knew his dad well enough to sense disrespect. It made his stomach twist. James, on the other hand, tried to brush it off. He didn't come here to argue with anyone. He was proud but not prideful. He'd been through worse things than an unkind word. Still, deep down, it stung a little, not because of what was said, but because it reminded him of how easily people forget. Forget what it means to serve. Forget the sacrifices that let them live ordinary, safe lives. The principal began calling names for awards, and the sound of applause filled the gym again. James forced a small smile, clapping along. He felt the ache in his knee, but ignored it. Each name called was a reminder of hope, of new beginnings. When Ethan's row stood up to move toward the stage, James straightened his tie and lifted his phone, ready to capture the moment. For a second, their eyes met, father and son, and Ethan smiled. That was enough to make everything fade away, even the sting of the officer's words. The crowd cheered as the students lined up, and James couldn't help but feel a rush of pride so deep it made his chest ache. He thought back to all the nights he'd stayed up helping Ethan with homework, the times he'd gone without so Ethan could have what he needed. Every hard moment felt worth it now. The ceremony continued smoothly, though Bradley's earlier smirk still lingered in the back of James's mind. The officer leaned casually against the wall, scrolling his phone, barely watching. James wondered if he'd ever understand what real service looked like, the kind that didn't come with power but sacrifice. But James didn't dwell on it. Today wasn't about proving anything. It was about Ethan, his son, his pride, his reason for everything. The band began playing softly again, and James looked around at the proud families, the flashing cameras, the smiling faces. For all its noise and chaos, it was a beautiful moment. He closed his eyes for a second and whispered to himself, "You made it, son." He didn't notice the way Ethan was looking back at him from the stage, or the faint trace of anger still burning behind his calm eyes as he caught sight of the officer nearby. Something told him this day wasn't over yet. The ceremony carried on with a cheerful rhythm. The band played a soft tune between speeches, and proud parents clapped for every name called. Cameras flashed in every corner, capturing smiles and teary eyes. James sat still, his hands folded over his cane. The earlier moment with the officer kept replaying in his mind, though he tried to shake it off. He told himself that people said careless things all the time. Maybe the man didn't mean any harm. Still, it bothered him, not for himself, but for what it represented. He'd spent his life believing in honor, and seeing it dismissed so casually hurt in a quiet way. He looked around, hoping to distract himself. On stage, a teacher spoke about the graduates' journey, their challenges and their bright future. James smiled again, watching his son among them. Ethan was listening closely, his hands folded neatly in his lap, his face calm but focused. When the teacher finished, the crowd clapped again. Then came a short pause as the principal stepped up to the microphone. "Before we begin giving out diplomas," she said with a warm smile, "we want to take a moment to recognize a few students who went above and beyond during their time here." A small shuffle moved through the crowd. Parents leaned forward, curious. The principal continued, "Each year we honor students who've made a real difference in our community. This next award is special. It goes to someone who showed compassion, leadership, and deep respect for those who've served our country." James tilted his head slightly, unsure who she was talking about. She smiled wider. "This year's Community Service Award goes to Ethan Miller." For a moment, James didn't move. The name took a second to sink in. Then his heart swelled. The room filled with applause as Ethan stood up, surprised but smiling shyly. James felt his throat tighten. He rose halfway from his chair, holding his phone up to take a picture. Around him, people clapped and cheered. Even a few veterans from town sitting in the back row stood to applaud. Ethan made his way to the stage, shaking hands with the principal and his teacher. The award was a small plaque, but it meant everything. The principal turned to the audience. "Ethan started a fundraiser earlier this year to support injured veterans. He did it quietly, with no thought of recognition. When asked why, he said it was because his father had taught him that service doesn't end when the uniform comes off." A wave of murmurs moved through the gym. Many people turned to look at James. He felt the attention and shifted slightly in his seat, his face warm. He wasn't used to being noticed like this. On stage, Ethan was handed the microphone. He looked nervous at first, glancing down at the paper he'd written notes on. But then he took a breath and looked up. His voice came out steady, though soft at first. "I started the fundraiser because I've seen what service really looks like," he began. "Not the kind that gets awards or medals. The kind that happens quietly, when someone gives everything and asks for nothing in return." The audience listened closely. His classmates, once whispering and giggling, fell silent. "My dad," Ethan continued, glancing toward where James sat, "served this country for over 20 years. He never talks about what he went through, but I've seen what it cost him. And I've seen how hard he works, even after all that." James swallowed hard, his eyes glistening. Ethan paused. A few people think service is something you can just move on from, that it's a story you leave behind. But the truth is, it's a part of who you are forever, and sometimes people forget what that means. They forget that the reason they get to live freely, to laugh, to celebrate, to even mock others, is because someone else once stood up and said, "I will." The gym was completely silent now. Even the faint hum of the air conditioner seemed to fade. Ethan's voice grew stronger. "So this award isn't just for me, it's for my dad, and for every veteran who's ever been made to feel small for doing something great. Respect doesn't cost anything, but it means everything." When he finished, there was a pause, just a breath of quiet before the entire gym erupted in applause. People stood up, clapping loudly. Some were wiping tears from their eyes. Others cheered his name. James sat still for a moment, his chest heavy with emotion. He wasn't expecting this. He'd never wanted recognition. But hearing those words from his son, it was more powerful than anything he'd ever felt. As the applause continued, James rose to his feet. He didn't salute this time. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Ethan, his heart full of pride. From across the gym, Officer Bradley stood frozen in place. The smirk that had been on his face earlier was gone. His arms dropped to his sides, his eyes darting toward James, then back to the stage. He looked uncomfortable, like a man suddenly realizing he had said too much and too loudly. Parents nearby glanced at him, some whispering quietly. The weight of Ethan's words hung in the air. Ethan handed the microphone back and stepped down from the stage. As he walked back to his seat, students reached out to pat his shoulder. He smiled politely, though his eyes searched for his dad in the crowd. When their eyes met again, James nodded slowly, his expression a mix of pride and gratitude. It was a look that said more than words ever could. The rest of the ceremony carried on, but something had changed in the room. The noise felt softer, more respectful. The laughter was lighter, the clapping more heartfelt. Even Officer Bradley, who had spent most of the ceremony leaning on the wall, now stood straight, his expression thoughtful and quiet. James sat down again, still processing everything. He didn't feel angry anymore. Whatever had been said before didn't matter now. His son had spoken for him, not out of anger but out of love. When the ceremony ended, people began to leave slowly, still talking about Ethan's speech. Some came up to James, shaking his hand, thanking him for his service. A few of the veterans approached him too, nodding respectfully. James smiled and thanked them, though his voice was quiet. Inside, he felt something he hadn't in a long time, a sense of peace. As the crowd thinned, he caught a glimpse of Officer Bradley near the exit. The man stood there, still wearing that uneasy look. The sun was already beginning to lower behind the school as people started leaving the gym. The sky outside glowed orange through the tall windows, and laughter filled the hallways. Families hugged, took pictures, and talked about plans for dinner and celebrations. James stayed seated for a moment after most people had gone. His heart was still heavy with emotion. He replayed Ethan's speech in his mind, every word, every pause, the way his son had looked so sure of himself. He felt proud beyond measure. Slowly, he pushed himself up, leaning on his cane. His knee ached, but he didn't mind. He took his time walking down the aisle toward the exit. When he stepped outside, the air felt cooler. The parking lot was full of parents calling out to their kids, cars honking, and graduates taking pictures with friends. Balloons floated above the crowd. Somewhere nearby, someone played music from a phone, and it mixed with the laughter in the air. Ethan stood near the front steps with a group of friends. He was holding his plaque, smiling for pictures. When he saw his dad walking toward him, he excused himself from the group and jogged over. "Dad," he called out, grinning. "They're talking about maybe going out for dinner. You'll come too, right?" James smiled faintly. "Wouldn't miss it for the world." Ethan looked proud. "You liked the speech?" James chuckled softly. "Liked it? You nearly stopped time in there, son. I'm not sure anyone's ever said something that true in that gym before." Ethan blushed a little, looking down. I didn't plan to say all that. I saw what happened earlier. I couldn't let it slide." James placed a hand on his shoulder. "You didn't have to defend me, Ethan. But you spoke from the heart, and that's what matters. That's what real men do. They stand for what's right, not for applause." Before Ethan could answer, a small silence grew behind them. They turned to see Officer Bradley walking toward them. His posture was different now, not as stiff or cocky as before. His sunglasses were gone, tucked into his shirt pocket. He stopped a few feet away, clearing his throat. "Mr. Miller," he said quietly. "Can I have a word?" Ethan straightened up slightly, his jaw tightening, but James gave a small nod. "Sure," he said calmly. Bradley shifted his weight, clearly uncomfortable. He glanced around, making sure no one was listening. I wanted to say I'm sorry. About earlier. What I said inside. It was out of line." James studied him for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I wasn't thinking," Bradley continued, his voice low. "I saw you stand up during the anthem and I made a stupid joke. I didn't mean anything by it, but that doesn't make it right. Your son's speech, it hit me harder than I expected." Ethan crossed his arms but stayed quiet. James nodded slowly. "I appreciate you saying that," he said. His tone was calm but firm. "Sometimes people forget what words can do. Respect doesn't need to be loud, it just needs to be real." Bradley nodded, his face red. "You're right. And I was wrong." For a moment they stood there in silence. The sounds of laughter and music from the parking lot filled the space between them. James finally extended his hand. Bradley hesitated for just a second, then shook it firmly. "Thank you," Bradley said, "for what you've done, and for raising a son who knows what honor means." James smiled faintly. "He taught me a few things too." Bradley nodded once more, then turned and walked away. He didn't look back. Ethan let out a long breath. "I didn't expect him to apologize." "Neither did I," James said softly. "But sometimes all a person needs is a mirror to see themselves clearly." They stood together for a moment, watching the sunset. The orange light reflected off the rows of parked cars, and the sound of laughter grew louder as more graduates reunited with their families. Ethan looked up at his dad. "You know, I think that speech might have done more than just make people clap." "It made them think." James smiled. "That's what truth does, son. It doesn't need anger. It just needs courage." A small group of Ethan's friends called his name, waving him over for another photo. James encouraged him to go. "Go on, enjoy your night." "You've earned it," Ethan grinned. "You sure you're okay standing here alone?" "I'm fine," James said, tapping his cane lightly. "I've stood through worse days." Ethan laughed softly and ran back toward his friends. James watched him, his heart full. He leaned against the railing by the steps, looking out at the sky. It had been years since he felt this proud. Not just proud of Ethan, but proud of the man his son had become. After a while, one of the older veterans from town approached. It was Tom, a man James had served with years ago. He walked with a slow gait but still carried that same quiet strength. "Didn't think I'd see you at one of these things again," Tom said with a grin. "Heard your boy gave quite the speech." James chuckled. "You heard right. Nearly made me cry in front of half the town." Tom nodded. "Good kid. He's got your backbone." "Maybe," James said softly, "but he's got his mother's heart. That's what keeps him grounded." They stood there for a while, just two old soldiers watching the next generation laugh and pose for pictures. After a few minutes, Tom patted James on the shoulder. "You did good, brother. Real good." James nodded, his eyes fixed on Ethan, who was now surrounded by friends laughing without a care. As the last of the sunlight faded, the crowd began to thin. Families headed to their cars, kids waved goodbye, and the sound of celebration slowly turned into the quiet hum of evening. Ethan came running back toward his dad, holding a bouquet of flowers someone had given him. "Here," he said with a grin, offering one to James. "They said these are for the person who inspired me." James laughed, shaking his head. "Flowers, huh? Haven't gotten these since your mom's garden days." Ethan smiled. "Then it's about time." They started walking toward the car together, their steps slow but steady. The streetlights were just flickering on, casting long shadows on the pavement. As they reached the car, James paused and looked back at the school one last time. The banners still fluttered in the breeze, the words Class of 2025 glowing faintly under the lights. He smiled quietly. "You know, son," he said, "today wasn't just your graduation. It was mine too, from the past." Ethan frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" James placed a hand on his shoulder. "For years I carried memories I couldn't put down. But today you reminded me that what we do and what we stand for, it matters. Even when people forget, it still matters." Ethan's eyes softened. "You've never been forgotten, Dad, not by me." James smiled and opened the car door. "Then that's all I need." They both got in. and as the car pulled away from the school, the sound of laughter and celebration faded behind them. Neither of them said much on the ride home. They didn't need to. The silence between. For the first time in a long while, James didn't feel like a man looking back. He felt like a father moving forward. Their eyes met for just a second. Bradley quickly looked away. James didn't say anything. He didn't need to. He just reached for his cane, took a deep breath, and waited for his son to come down the aisle. Ethan was smiling as he approached, holding his plaque. "Did I do okay, Dad?" he asked softly. James rested a hand on his shoulder. "You did better than okay, son," he said, his voice low and steady. "You reminded a few people of something important today." The next morning, sunlight slipped through the curtains of the small living room where James sat with his coffee. The quiet hum of the ceiling fan filled the space. On the table beside him was Ethan's award plaque from the night before. He kept glancing at it, smiling every time. It had been a long time since he'd felt such peace. For years, his mornings began with pain in his leg and heavy memories that came with the silence. But today was different. The ache was still there, but his heart felt lighter. He picked up the plaque and ran his fingers over the engraved letters. "For compassion and service to the community." The words brought a small smile to his face. In the kitchen, he heard Ethan moving around, probably making toast. James leaned back in his chair, thinking about how much had changed in just one night. The speech, the apology, the quiet ride home, it all played like a movie in his head. Ethan walked into the room holding 2 mugs of coffee. "You were up early," he said. "Old habit," James replied with a grin. "Soldiers don't sleep in." Ethan handed him the mug and sat across from him. "You thinking about last night?" James nodded. "Can't help it. You really had that room frozen in their seats, son. I don't think anyone's going to forget that speech." Ethan laughed softly. "I didn't mean to make it a big thing. I just wanted people to remember what you've done, what others like you have done." James looked down at his coffee, his voice quiet. "You reminded more than just them, Ethan. You reminded me too. I used to think nobody cared anymore. You proved me wrong." For a moment they sat in silence. The house was still except for the faint ticking of the clock on the wall. Then there was a knock at the door. Ethan looked up. "You expecting someone?" James shook his head. "Not that I know of." Ethan stood and went to open the door. Standing outside was Officer Bradley, wearing a plain shirt and jeans this time, not his uniform. He looked a little nervous, holding a small envelope in his hand. "Morning," he said softly. Ethan's expression tightened for a second, but James called out, "It's all right. Let him in." Bradley stepped inside, looking around awkwardly. "I hope I'm not intruding." "Not at all," James said. "Coffee?" Bradley shook his head. "No, thank you. I just wanted to stop by and say something." Ethan stood near the doorway, arms crossed, while James stayed seated, calm and composed. Bradley took a slow breath. "I thought about what you and your son said yesterday. It's been eating at me. I've worn a badge for 12 years, but somewhere along the way, I forgot what respect really means. It's not about power. It's about humility." He placed the envelope on the table. "I wanted to do something small to make it right. Inside is a donation for your son's fundraiser. It's not much, but I wanted to contribute." Ethan looked at the envelope, then at Bradley. His expression softened a little. James nodded slowly. "That's a good thing to do. But more than that, showing up here took courage." Bradley's voice grew quiet. "Last night when your son spoke, I realized something. I've been in uniform so long that I stopped seeing the people behind it. I forgot that there are different kinds of service, some seen, some not." James smiled gently. "You remembered now. That's what matters." For the first time since they met, Bradley looked genuinely at ease. He reached out his hand again. James shook it firmly. Before leaving, Bradley turned to Ethan. "You've got a good father, kid, and you're going to do great things." Ethan nodded politely. "Thank you." After the door closed, Ethan sat back down with a sigh. "You think he really means it?" James took a sip of his coffee. "He wouldn't have come here if he didn't. People don't often admit when they're wrong. That takes more strength than most realize." Ethan smiled a little. "Guess your speech changed more than the mood in that gym." James laughed. "Maybe it did." The day passed quietly. They spent most of it in the backyard, cleaning up the garden and talking about college plans. The smell of cut grass filled the air. It felt like life had slowed down in the best way possible. As the evening sun dipped low, they sat on the porch watching the sky change colors. The world around them seemed softer now, calmer, kinder. You know, Ethan said after a while. Last night felt like something big shifted. Not just for me, but for everyone, James nodded slowly. You'd be surprised how much one voice can do. People remember honesty. They remember kindness even more. He paused and looked out toward the horizon. For a long time I thought my time had passed, that I had nothing more to give. But seeing you up there, hearing what you said, it reminded me that what we do matters even years later. Ethan leaned back in his chair. You've done more than you know, Dad. You've given people an example to follow. Even that officer saw it. James chuckled softly. Maybe he just needed a wake-up call. They both laughed, and for a moment everything felt light again. As night settled in, the air grew cooler. The stars began to appear one by one. Ethan stood and stretched. I'm going to head inside and call a few friends. We're planning a small get-together this weekend. You'll come, right? James smiled. Of course. Wouldn't miss it. Ethan grinned and went inside, leaving James alone on the porch. He sat quietly, looking up at the stars. The cane rested beside him, the wood worn smooth from years of use. He ran his hand over it, thinking about all the places it had been, all the things it had seen. Then he looked back at the window where he could see Ethan moving around, laughing on the phone. A wave of gratitude filled him, not just for his son, but for the second chances life sometimes gives when you least expect them. The night air carried the faint sound of crickets and distant laughter. James leaned back, closing his eyes for a moment. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a veteran being forgotten. He felt like a father being remembered. And deep down, he knew that something as simple as a few honest words had changed not just one man, but maybe an entire room full of people. A few weeks had passed since graduation, but people in town were still talking about Ethan's speech. At the grocery store, at the diner, even at church on Sundays. Folks mentioned how quiet that gym had gotten and how one young man had reminded everyone what respect really meant. James didn't like attention, but he couldn't help smiling whenever someone mentioned it. He always said the same thing. It wasn't my moment. It was his. Life slowly went back to normal. Ethan spent most of his days helping at the local community center and preparing for college. James kept himself busy doing odd repairs around the house and meeting with a few of his old friends from the veterans group. But something had changed in both of them. There was a lightness now, a quiet peace that hadn't been there before. One afternoon, Ethan came home holding an envelope with the school logo on it. Dad, he said, grinning, they're asking me to come back next week. They want me to give a short talk to next year's seniors about community service. James smiled, leaning on his cane. They picked the right person for that. Ethan laughed. You'll come with me, right? Wouldn't miss it. The following week came quickly. On the day of the talk, the gym looked almost the same as it had on graduation night. The same rows of chairs, the same banners, even the faint smell of fresh paint and polished floors. Ethan stood near the front of the stage, going over his notes while James found a seat near the back. He didn't like the spotlight, but being there to support his son mattered more than anything. As the students filed in, the principal walked over to greet him. Mr. Miller, she said warmly, I'm so glad you came. Your son's words really touched a lot of people last time. Even some of the staff said it changed how they see things. James smiled humbly. He's got a good heart. I just tried to raise him that way. When the talk began, Ethan stepped up to the microphone. He didn't sound nervous this time. His voice was steady, calm, and sure. Last time I stood here, he began, I was just a student, talking about something I cared about. I didn't know my words would mean so much. But now I see that when you speak the truth with kindness, people listen. The students watched him closely, some leaning forward. He continued, I talked about my dad that day, about respect, about service. But what I didn't say is that those lessons aren't just for veterans or soldiers. They're for everyone. We all serve in some way. Our families, our communities, our neighbors. And the way we treat people can make a bigger difference than we think. From his seat in the back, James watched with quiet pride. He could see himself in his son, not in how he looked, but in the way he carried himself with calm strength and kindness. When the talk ended, the students gave Ethan a warm round of applause. Several teachers shook his hand, thanking him for speaking. As they walked out afterward, James placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "You did it again," he said softly. Ethan grinned. "Guess I get that from you." They walked to the car together, the afternoon sun bright and warm. The town felt alive, full of familiar faces and small smiles from people passing by. Later that evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sun dip low, a car pulled into the driveway. It was Officer Bradley. He stepped out wearing his uniform again, but his posture was different now. Respectful, genuine. He walked up the porch steps holding a framed certificate. "Evening, Mr. Miller." "Ethan," he greeted. James nodded politely. "Evening, officer." Bradley smiled faintly. "Actually, you can call me Tom now. Feels strange saying officer after everything." He handed James the frame. Inside was a letter with the police department's seal. "It's a recognition," Bradley explained, "for community impact. After what happened at the graduation, I spoke to the chief. We started a new program, pairing officers with local veterans to volunteer together. Thought you might want to be part of it." James looked at the certificate quietly, reading the words slowly. It wasn't just an award, it was a thank you. He looked up, his eyes soft. "That's a good thing you're doing." "Real good," Bradley nodded. "I wouldn't have thought of it if it weren't for that night. Sometimes it takes being humbled to understand what honor really means." Ethan smiled. "I'd like to help too, if that's okay." Bradley grinned. "We'd love that." They talked for a few minutes before Bradley headed off. As his car pulled away, the air felt even lighter than before. James leaned back in his chair, watching the last streaks of sunlight fade. "You know, son," he said quietly, "life has a way of bringing things full circle. One small moment, one word can change everything." Ethan nodded. "That night changed a lot of people, didn't it?" "It did," James replied. "It reminded people that respect isn't something you demand. It's something you earn, and sometimes something you give first." The sky turned dark, the first stars flickering above them. Fireflies blinked in the yard, glowing softly in the grass. Ethan leaned back, resting his hands behind his head. "You ever think about how many lives you've touched, Dad? Not just through your service, but through how you live?" James chuckled. "I think about how lucky I am to have a son who sees it." They sat in silence for a while, both lost in thought. The sound of crickets filled the air. After a few minutes, Ethan spoke again. "You know what I realized? When people talk about heroes, they always think of someone far away. But sometimes the real heroes are sitting right next to us, drinking coffee, fixing things, showing up every single day." James looked at him, his eyes glistening. "That might be the truest thing you've ever said." The night grew cooler and the soft wind rustled the trees. James took a deep breath, the smell of summer air filling his lungs. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a man trying to prove anything. He didn't feel like someone forgotten by time. He felt seen. He felt whole. Ethan turned to him and said quietly, "You know, when I gave that speech, I thought it was for you. But now I think it was for everyone, even me." James smiled. "That's how truth works, son. You give it away, and somehow it gives something back." They stayed there long into the night, talking about small things, the past, the future, and the simple joys of everyday life. As the last porch light flickered, James looked up at the sky full of stars and whispered to himself, "Thank you." He didn't say who he was thanking, maybe life, maybe fate, maybe just the quiet peace that finally found him. Inside, on the mantel above the fireplace, sat two things side by side: Ethan's award plaque and the framed certificate from the police department. Both told a story of respect, forgiveness, and change. It wasn't about medals or applause. It was about people, about hearts that learned to see each other again. And as the night wrapped around their little home, James smiled softly. The world still had its flaws, but it also had moments like this, small, honest moments where everything felt right. For him, that was enough.